I opened my front door one morning and found two federal agents standing on the other side. They told me someone had reported me to immigration authorities. I had lived in this country for 26 years. I was a citizen. My wife was a citizen. My sons were born here. And while those agents stood in my living room reviewing my papers, the papers that proved I had every right to exist in my own home, I looked out the window. My neighbor was watching from across the parking lot, and I knew, in that moment, that this was not a mistake. This was a choice. What happened next changed everything I thought I understood about belonging, about justice, and about what it really costs to fight for the life you spent decades building. This is my story, and I am not done telling it. I remember it clearly because it was the kind of morning I had learned to love in America. Quiet, cool, with the smell of coffee still drifting from the kitchen and the sound of my wife humming something in Hindi from the other room. I was working from home that day, the way I had been doing for a few years by then, sitting at the desk I had set up near the window that looked out onto the parking lot. When I heard the knock, I assumed it was a delivery. We ordered things online often. My wife had recently started buying spices in bulk from a store that shipped from New Jersey, and there was always something arriving at the door. So I stood up without urgency, walked to the door, and opened it with the kind of ease that comes from 26 years of feeling safe in a country that had, for the most part, been good to me. Two men were standing outside. They were wearing plain clothes, not uniforms, but there was something about the way they held themselves, the posture, the stillness, the way their eyes moved to my face before I had even fully opened the door, that told me immediately this was not a delivery. They showed me their identification. Federal agents. I don't remember every word they said in those first few seconds. My mind does something strange in moments like that. It slows certain things down and blurs others. What I do remember, with absolute clarity, is one sentence. Mr. Patel, we received a report regarding your immigration status. I stood there for a moment without speaking. I was 50 years old. I had lived in the United States for 26 years. I had worked, paid taxes, raised two children, and built a life that I was genuinely proud of. 12 years ago, after a process that took years and tested every limit of my patience, I had received my American citizenship. My wife had received hers. My children had been born in this country. I was, by every legal definition, exactly as American as the men standing at my door. And yet, there they were. I asked them to come in. I don't know why I did that. Perhaps because it was the polite thing to do. Perhaps because I was still trying to understand what was happening. My wife came out of the kitchen when she heard unfamiliar voices. She looked at me, then at them, and I watched her face change the way a face changes when something it doesn't understand begins to feel like something dangerous. I told her, in Hindi, not to worry. I didn't believe my own words. The agents were professional. They were not rude. They explained that they had received an anonymous complaint that a foreign national was living in the building without proper documentation. They said they were required to follow up on all reports. They said this was routine. Routine. That word stayed with me for a long time afterward. I brought them my passport, my naturalization certificate, my wife's documents, the birth certificates of both our sons. I laid everything on the kitchen table the way a man lays down proof of his own existence. Each document a small argument against the accusation that had brought these strangers to my door. They reviewed everything carefully. It took maybe 20 minutes. Then they thanked me, told me everything was in order, and left. And that should have been the end of it. But before I closed the door, I looked out toward the parking lot. He was standing on his balcony, my neighbor, Gary Chen. He was not looking at anything in particular. He had a cup of something in his hand, and his eyes were moving slowly across the lot, the way someone looks at something they have already seen many times. But when his gaze reached my door, when he saw me standing there watching him, something passed across his face. It was not guilt exactly. It was more like satisfaction. And in that moment, I knew. I had moved into Birchwood Gardens 14 months earlier. The complex was not large. Maybe 40 units spread across 3 buildings arranged in a loose U-shape around a central courtyard. There was a small swimming pool that the residents shared, a fitness room that almost no one used, and a parking lot that was always slightly too full. The buildings were beige and well-maintained, and the kind of ordinary that becomes beautiful when you have spent years dreaming of it. My wife, Meena, had seen the listing online and called me immediately. "Rakesh," she said, "this is it. This is exactly what I always wanted." She was not wrong. We had been living in a smaller apartment in a noisier part of the city for years. A perfectly fine place, but one that had always felt temporary. This felt permanent. The kind of place where you put down roots. We signed the lease in March and moved in the following month. The first few weeks were everything we had hoped for. The neighbors were pleasant enough. A young couple on the ground floor who smiled when we passed. An older woman named Margaret, who kept a cat and always asked about my sons. A family with 3 young children who made noise on weekend mornings and apologized every time they saw us. Gary Chen lived directly across the hall from us. The first time I saw him, he was carrying groceries from the elevator. He was perhaps 55, lean, with close-cut hair and the kind of careful stillness that some people carry as a natural quality and others practice deliberately. I introduced myself. He nodded and said hello and continued down the hall without stopping. I did not think anything of it. Some people are private. I respected that. I had no desire to force a friendship with anyone. But over the following weeks, I began to notice things. Small things at first. When I walked to my car in the morning, I would sometimes catch a movement at his window, a curtain shifting, a shape stepping back from the glass. When my family spoke in the hallway, even briefly and quietly, I would hear his door close a second later, as if he had been listening just inside it. When we used the pool on weekends, he would sometimes appear on the deck above, not swimming, not reading, simply present in a way that felt less like relaxation and more like observation. I told myself I was being oversensitive. It had happened before. That particular alertness that develops in a person who has spent decades navigating spaces where they are sometimes the only face that looks like theirs. You learn to read rooms. You learn to track small signals. And you also learn that sometimes those signals mean nothing at all. So I kept my distance. I was polite when we passed in the hallway. I did not complain about his parking, even once, when his car was slightly over the line and my door scraped the concrete pillar. I was determined to be a good neighbor. But good intentions, I have learned over 50 years, do not always travel in both directions. 2 days after the agents came to my door, I received a letter from the building's management office. It informed me that a formal complaint had been filed against me by another resident, citing, and I remember the exact words, concerns about undocumented individuals residing in the unit. The letter stated that the complaint had been reviewed and found to be without merit. It also stated that the matter was considered closed. Closed. As if something that reaches inside your chest and squeezes until you can barely breathe is the kind of thing that closes. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after reading that letter. Meena was in the bedroom with the door partially open. I could hear the television, a cooking program she watched every afternoon. My younger son, Arjun, was at school. My older son, Dev, was at work across the city. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. And yet I felt something I had not felt since my earliest years in this country. A particular kind of smallness, the sensation of being looked at and found wanting, of existing in a space and being told without words that the space was not truly yours. I picked up the letter again. I read it again, and then I thought about Gary Chen standing on his balcony with his cup in his hand, and I understood that this was not over. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. I have felt it before, in my first years here, when I was young and still learning the rhythms of a country that did not always know what to do with me. It is the exhaustion of having to prove yourself not once, not twice, but continuously, in ways that other people never have to think about. The exhaustion of walking into a room and feeling the room adjust itself around you, of speaking and watching someone's face decide whether to listen before you have even finished your sentence. I thought I had left that exhaustion behind. I was wrong. In the days after the federal agents came to my door, I moved through the apartment differently. I noticed it myself, the way I paused before going into the hallway, The way I listened at the door for sounds before opening it. The way I became conscious of how loud our voices were when Mina and I spoke in Hindi in the kitchen. These were small things, unconscious adjustments. But they accumulated the way small things always do, quietly and without announcement, until one morning I realized that I had not once that week stepped outside to get the mail without first checking through the window to see if Gary was on his balcony. That was when I knew something had to be done, not because I was afraid of him, but because fear was beginning to become a habit, and I refused to let that happen in my own home. I decided to speak to the building manager. Her name was Patricia Holloway. She was a woman in her late 40s who ran the office on the ground floor of Building B with the precise efficiency of someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that managing 40 households meant managing 40 sets of problems. She was not unkind, but she was careful, the way people in positions of small authority often are, measuring every word against the possibility of complaint. I made an appointment and came prepared. I brought the letter she had sent me. I brought printed copies of my naturalization certificate and my wife's. I brought a brief, handwritten timeline of the incidents I had observed, the looks, the surveillance, the curtain movements, the letter from management itself. I had typed it the night before, sitting at my desk while Mina slept, trying to organize my thoughts into something that would be taken seriously rather than dismissed as the anxiety of a man who was imagining things. Patricia listened. She sat across from me with her hands folded on her desk, and she listened with the kind of expression that is carefully designed to communicate nothing. When I finished, she said, "Mr. Patel, I understand your concerns." I had heard that sentence before. It is the sentence people use when they want to acknowledge that you have spoken without committing to having actually heard you. I told her that I believed my neighbor had been the one who filed the anonymous complaint with immigration authorities. She said she could not confirm or deny who had filed any complaint. I told her that regardless of who filed it, a false report had been made against me and my family, people who had been citizens of this country for 12 years, and that this constituted at minimum harassment. She said she understood. I asked her what the building intended to do about it. She said she would review the matter and follow up with me within the week. I left her office with the particular hollow feeling of a conversation that had all the correct shape and none of the substance. That evening, Dev called. My older son was 23 and worked at a software company downtown. He had inherited my habits. The long hours, the careful attention to detail, the refusal to stop working until a problem was solved. He also had his mother's instinct for knowing when something was wrong before anyone said so. "Dad," he said, "you sound tired." I told him about the agents. I had not told him before. I had wanted to wait until I understood more of what had happened. Or perhaps I had simply wanted to protect him from it, the way fathers protect their children from things, even when the children are old enough to handle them. He was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then he said, "We need to document everything." I had already begun doing that. But something about hearing him say it, hearing the steadiness in his voice, the immediate shift into problem-solving mode, the way he did not panic or catastrophize but simply moved toward the next step, made me feel, for the first time since that Tuesday morning, something close to calm. We talked for almost an hour. He asked questions. I answered them. He took notes on his end, and I took notes on mine. By the time we hung up, we had a list. Photograph every interaction if possible, keep a written log with dates and times, consult with an attorney who specialized in tenant rights, and file a formal complaint with the city's Human Rights Office. It was a plan. And having a plan, I have always believed, is the first step toward not being destroyed by something. But plans do not prepare you for everything. 3 days later, I was in the elevator when Gary got in on the second floor. It was the first time we had been alone together since the agents had come. The elevator in our building was small, barely enough space for 4 people, and the ride from the second floor to the lobby took perhaps 15 seconds. I was facing the doors. He stepped in behind me and stood to my left. I could see him in the slight reflection of the metal panel. He did not say anything. Neither did I. 15 seconds is not a long time, but in a small enclosed space, with a man you believe has tried to have your family removed from the country you have lived in for over 2 decades, 15 seconds is enough time for a great many things to pass through your mind. I thought about the agents at my door. I thought about Mina's face when she came out of the kitchen and saw them. I thought about the letter from management with its careful, bloodless language. I thought about the morning I arrived in this country at 24 years old, carrying 2 suitcases and an engineering degree, and the absolute certainty that if I worked hard enough, I could build something real here. I thought about 26 years of building. The doors opened at the lobby. Gary walked out first. He did not look back. I stood in the elevator for a moment after he left, breathing slowly, the way I had learned to breathe when I needed to keep myself from saying something I could not take back. Then I stepped out and went to get my mail. The attorney's name was Sandra Okafor. Dev had found her through a colleague whose family had used her firm for a tenant dispute the previous year. She was in her mid-40s, direct in a way I found immediately reassuring, and she had spent 15 years working cases that involved housing discrimination and civil rights violations. She reviewed my documentation in the first meeting and asked questions that told me she had done this before, not just professionally, but in a way that suggested she understood what it felt like from the inside. "What you're describing," she said, "is a pattern. The surveillance, the complaint, the management's non-response. Individually, each piece is small. Together, they build something." I asked her what they built. "A case," she said, "potentially a strong one." She explained that filing a false report with a federal agency about a person's immigration status, when the motivation is discrimination based on national origin or ethnicity, could constitute a violation of federal civil rights law. She said that the Fair Housing Act also had provisions relevant to what I had described. She said that the key was establishing intent, connecting Gary's behavior to the report in a way that went beyond coincidence. That would not be simple, but it was possible. I drove home from her office with something I had not expected to feel, the specific, quiet anger of a man who has decided to stop absorbing and start responding. That night, I sat at my desk after Mina had gone to sleep. I opened a new document on my computer. At the top, I typed a single line, "Everything I remember," and I began to write. Not for the attorney, not for the court, not for the management office or the city or anyone else. For myself, because I had learned, over 50 years, that when someone tries to make you feel like you do not belong in your own life, the most important thing you can do is remember, in exact detail, with dates and words and the precise quality of the light on a Tuesday morning, that you were there, that you existed, that you were real, and that no one had the right to erase that. The document grew longer every night. I had started it as a simple record, dates, times, observations. But somewhere in the second week of writing, it became something else. It became the kind of thing you write not because someone will read it, but because you need to put it somewhere outside of yourself before it consumes you from the inside. I wrote about Gary and the elevator and the curtain that moved. I wrote about the agents and their professional voices, and the 20 minutes they spent reviewing the papers that proved I had every right to exist in my own home. I wrote about Mina's face. I wrote about the particular silence that fell over our apartment in the days after. A silence that was not peaceful but cautious. The silence of people who have been reminded that safety is not a permanent condition. I had not told Mina everything. I had told her about the agents, of course. She had been there. I had told her about my meeting with Patricia Holloway and about Sandra Okafor and the legal process we were beginning. But I had not told her the full weight of what I was carrying, the specific, grinding quality of lying awake at 2 a.m. and running the same calculations over and over, whether to pursue the case or let it go, whether fighting would protect us or simply make us a target for something worse. Whether there was a version of this story that ended with our family still intact and still believing, as we had believed for so long, that this country was ours. I did not tell her because she had her own weight to carry, and because I had spent 30 years being the person in our family who absorbed things quietly. It was not a role I had chosen consciously. It was simply the shape I had taken over time. Sandra called me on a Thursday afternoon with news. She had contacted the federal agency that had sent the agents to my door and formally requested information about the complaint under applicable privacy and disclosure provisions, The agency could not identify the complainant directly, but through a process I will not pretend to fully understand, she had been able to establish that the complaint had been filed from within our building's zip code on the same day that Gary had been home, a day I had noted in my log because his car had not moved from the parking lot. It was not proof, but it was something. "It's a thread," Sandra said, "and threads, when you pull them carefully, sometimes unravel the whole thing." She told me she was also looking into Gary's background. Not to find something to use against him as a person, she was careful to clarify, but to understand whether there was a pattern, whether this was the first time he had done something like this, or whether it was part of something larger and more deliberate. I told her to pull the thread. What she found took me by surprise. Gary Chen had lived in Birchwood Gardens for 7 years. In that time, he had filed 11 formal complaints with building management. I had been given copies of some of them as part of Sandra's document request. They concerned noise violations, parking disputes, a shared laundry room scheduling conflict, and, this is the one that stopped me when I read it, a complaint against a family on the 3rd floor from 2 years earlier. The family's name was Okonkwo. They were Nigerian American. The complaint alleged that they were operating an unlicensed business from their unit. Management had investigated and found no evidence of any such business. The complaint was dismissed. The Okonkwo family moved out 4 months later. I read that line 3 times. I thought about what it must have felt like to be the Okonkwo family, to move into a building you had chosen carefully, a building in a neighborhood you had worked to afford, and to find someone on the other side of the wall who was watching you and waiting for a reason to push you out. I thought about whether they had known, when they left, that it was not really about noise or parking or unlicensed businesses, whether they had known that the complaints were simply the mechanism, the available tool, that someone had chosen to make them feel unwelcome enough to leave. I wondered if Gary had stood on his balcony and watched the Okonkwo family carry their boxes to the moving truck. I wondered if he had felt the same satisfaction I had seen cross his face when the agents came to my door. Mina found me sitting at the kitchen table that evening with the printed complaint in my hand. She sat down across from me without speaking. She looked at the document, and then at my face, and then back at the document. "Show me," she said. I showed her. She read slowly. She was a careful reader, had always been, the kind of person who does not move on until she has fully understood what she is looking at. When she finished, she set the paper down and was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I was not expecting. "I want to stay." I looked at her. "I know you've been thinking about it," she said, "about whether it would be easier to just move somewhere else. Find a different building. Avoid the whole thing." She was not wrong. The thought had crossed my mind more than once. The exhausted practical calculation of whether the energy required to fight was worth what it would cost us in time and stress, and the particular toll that conflict takes on a family. We were comfortable. We had options. We did not need this fight the way some people need fights to survive. But Mina was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on her face in a long time. "We have been moving our whole lives," she said, "from Gujarat to Ahmedabad. From Ahmedabad to here, from the first apartment to the second to the third, always adjusting, always making ourselves smaller so that someone else could be comfortable." She paused. "I am 51 years old. I am a citizen of this country. My children were born here, and I am tired of making myself smaller." I did not have anything to say to that, because she was right, and because I had been thinking the same thing for weeks without finding the words for it. Dev and Arjun came over for dinner that Sunday. We had not told Arjun the full story yet. He was 19, and in his first year of college, and I had wanted to protect him from it, the way I had initially wanted to protect Dev. But Mina had pointed out, quietly, in the kitchen while we were cooking, that he was not a child anymore, and that protecting him from the truth was its own kind of disrespect. So we told him. He listened the way young people listen when something they thought was abstract suddenly becomes real, with a stillness that is not calm, but the thing that happens just before calm breaks. When I finished, he asked a single question. "Has this happened to you before? Before this?" I thought about the question carefully. "Yes," I said. "Different forms, different people, but yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Did you fight back?" "Sometimes," I said. "Not always." "Why not always?" It was the kind of question that a 19-year-old asks because he does not yet know the full cost of fighting. Not because he is naive, Arjun was not naive, but because he had grown up in a country and a family that had, by the time he was old enough to notice such things, already absorbed most of the cost on his behalf. I told him the truth. "Because sometimes you are too tired," I said. "And sometimes you are too afraid. And sometimes you tell yourself it is not worth it. And sometimes," I paused, "sometimes you simply do not know that fighting is an option." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "But you know now." And I said, "Yes, I know now." Sandra filed the formal complaint with the city's Human Rights Commission on a Wednesday morning in November. She called me after to let me know it had been submitted. I was sitting at my desk, the same desk I had been sitting at on the Tuesday morning when the agents knocked on my door. Outside the window, the parking lot was quiet. The sky was the flat gray of a city preparing for winter. Gary's car was in its usual spot. I hung up the phone and sat there for a while. I thought about 26 years. I thought about the young man who had arrived at this airport with 2 suitcases and an engineering degree and the absolute certainty that effort would be enough. That if you worked hard and kept your head down and caused no trouble and built something real, the ground beneath you would stay solid. I thought about how long I had believed that, and I thought about what it had cost me to believe it. Outside, a car pulled into the lot. Someone I did not recognize. They got out, walked to Building A, and disappeared through the door. I turned back to my desk. There was still work to do. The Human Rights Commission process was not fast. I had been warned about this. Sandra had told me in our first meeting that these things moved at the pace of institutions, which is to say, slowly and with the particular indifference of systems that process many cases and belong fully to none of them. I understood this intellectually, but understanding something intellectually and living inside it are different experiences entirely. Months passed. Winter came and went. The parking lot filled with dirty snow, and then the snow melted, and the courtyard outside turned green again, and still we waited. I went to work. I came home. I added entries to my document. I had dinner with my family on Sundays, and tried, with uneven success, to leave the weight of the case outside the door when I did. Gary was still across the hall. We passed each other perhaps once a week, in the elevator, in the hallway, at the mailboxes. He never spoke to me. I never spoke to him. We had developed the particular choreography of 2 people who have decided, by mutual and unspoken agreement, to pretend the other does not fully exist. It was not a comfortable arrangement, but it was functional, and in the absence of resolution, functional was what we had. Mina handled it better than I did. She had always been that way, more capable than me of placing something in a mental compartment and closing the door on it while she got on with living. She cooked. She called her sister in Ahmedabad every Sunday. She started a garden on our small balcony, tomatoes and cilantro, and a single stubborn rose that bloomed 3 times that spring, and which she photographed every time, as though it were doing something miraculous. I watched her water those plants in the evenings and thought about what she had said at the kitchen table. I am tired of making myself smaller. I had been thinking about those words for months, not obsessively, but the way you think about something that has settled into you permanently, not always in the foreground, but always present. The way a scar is always present even when you are not looking at it. The commission's investigator contacted us in April. Her name was Diane Reyes, and she was thorough in a way that inspired confidence. She had reviewed all of our documentation, interviewed Patricia Holloway, reviewed the building's complaint history, and spoken with 2 other former residents whose names had come up in the course of the investigation. One of them, she told Sandra, had described experiences that closely paralleled ours. I did not ask if it was the Okonkwo family. I think I already knew. The investigation took 3 more months. During that time, Sandra also pursued the civil case separately, building the argument that what had happened to us constituted discrimination under the Fair Housing Act, and that the building management had failed in its legal obligation to address it adequately. It was in June, on an evening when the city was warm and the windows were open, and I could hear someone playing music 2 floors above us that Sandra called with the Commission's preliminary finding. They had found sufficient evidence to support a determination of discriminatory harassment based on national origin. I sat down when she told me. I don't think I said anything for several seconds. Sandra, to her credit, let the silence be what it was. The resolution came in stages. The Commission issued a formal finding. The building management, faced with the finding and Sandra's civil case simultaneously, entered into a negotiated settlement that included, among other things, mandatory fair housing training for all staff, a formal written policy on complaint procedures, and a financial settlement that I will not detail here, except to say that it was enough to matter. Gary's situation was more complicated. Filing a false report with a federal agency is a serious matter. Whether what Gary had done met the specific legal threshold for criminal prosecution was a question that ultimately rested with the federal prosecutor's office, and the answer they gave was that the case was not strong enough for criminal charges, given the difficulty of proving intent beyond a reasonable doubt. I will not pretend that did not disappoint me. It did, but Sandra had prepared me for this possibility. She had told me from the beginning that the civil and administrative paths were the more likely routes to meaningful accountability, and that criminal prosecution in cases like this was rare. I had understood, and yet understanding and accepting are, again, different things, and it took me some time to move from one to the other. What did happen to Gary was this. He received a formal notice from the Commission. He was named in the civil settlement as a contributing party, and the building management, under the terms of their agreement, reviewed his tenancy. 3 months after the settlement, he moved out of Birchwood Gardens. I did not see him leave. Mina did. She was on the balcony with her tomatoes when the moving truck came. She watched him carry boxes out and load them into the truck and drive away. She did not say anything to him. He did not say anything to her. When it was over, she came inside and told me what she had seen with the same calm, measured tone she used for everything. Then she went back to her plants. I have thought often, in the time since, about what I would say if someone asked me whether it was worth it. The answer is not simple. It cost us more than a year of peace. It cost us money. The settlement covered some of it, but not all. It cost us sleep and dinner-time conversations that should have been about ordinary things, and were instead about legal strategy and document requests and the particular fatigue of having to prove, over and over again, that you deserve to be where you are. It cost my sons something I cannot fully measure, the loss of a particular innocence, the confirmation of something they had perhaps suspected, but had not yet had to know with certainty. That the country they were born in, the country they had grown up loving without reservation, was also a country where a man could look at their father's face and decide, on the basis of that face alone, that he did not belong. That knowledge does not leave a person. I know this, because it had not left me, and I had carried it since before they were born. But here is what else is true. We stayed. We are still here, in the same apartment, in the same building, with the same parking lot outside the window, and the same elevator, and the same mailboxes in the lobby. Mina's rose bloomed again this spring, 4 times, which she considers a personal victory. Arjun finished his first year of college and came home for the summer, and spent 3 weeks doing almost nothing except sleeping late and eating his mother's cooking, which is exactly what he should have been doing. Dev got a promotion in March, and called me from the office parking lot to tell me, his voice carrying that particular quality of someone trying to sound casual about something they are genuinely proud of. We had Sunday dinners. We spoke Hindi in the kitchen. We went to the pool on weekends and sat in the sun and talked about ordinary things. And I wrote in my document, not about Gary anymore, not about agents or complaints or legal filings, but about other things, about the rose. About the music I heard from 2 floors above on that June evening when Sandra called. About the way the parking lot looks on a winter morning when the snow is fresh and the light is just coming up and everything, for a moment, is quiet and clean and still. About what it means to have built something real. I am 50 years old. I have lived in this country for 26 years. I have worked harder than I ever expected to work, loved more than I knew I was capable of loving. and lost things I did not know I had until they were threatened. I have been made to feel, on more occasions than I care to count, that the ground beneath me was less solid than I had believed. But I am still here. My family is still here. And the ground, our ground, the ground we worked for and paid for and earned in every sense of the word, held. I want to say something to anyone reading this who has felt what I felt on that Tuesday morning when the knock came at the door, who has stood in their own home and been made to feel like a trespasser, who has carried documents proving their right to exist in a space that was theirs and laid them on a table and waited while a stranger decided whether to believe them. I want to say, document everything. Find people who know how to fight on your behalf. Do not make yourself smaller to make someone else comfortable. Do not leave because leaving feels easier than staying. And do not let anyone, not a neighbor, not a complaint, not a system, not a single ordinary Tuesday morning, convince you that you do not belong in the life you built. You do. I promise you, you do.